Hello everybody, it's Jabbar here. About a year ago I released an alternate history video outlining a fictional encounter between West Africans and Mesoamericans, based on the transatlantic voyage that King Abubakar II embarked on in the year 1311, never to be heard from again. Today we'll be doing the same thing again, but it'll be the other way around, with Native American sailors reaching the West African coast, and a little earlier, in the year 1295. This will be a two-part video just as the other one was, but this time my good friend Aztlan Historian will be hosting the second part on his channel. The best way to describe his channel is basically a Native American version of mine, so be sure to check out some of his content as well while you're there. So anyway, without further ado, let's begin with this awesome alternate scenario. So in the year 1295, a group of 100 Taino merchants are washed out into the deep sea by tropical storm waves. Fortunately for them, they had plenty of food and supplies, as they had all of their goods stocked away and were fleeing tribal violence in the Antilles. However, instead of turning back, they were taken by a current which led them directly to the Azores off the coast of Iberia. Weak and impoverished, they set foot on the island, only to realize that it is utterly and completely uninhabited. But soon they noticed through telltale signs such as birds and debris that there must be other lands to the east. After establishing a small settlement on the islands, they soon discover more islands, but to no avail, and have no choice but to continue east as the birds and debris come from the east and they cannot find a current that will take them back home in the west. Eventually, the lost sailors get caught in another current, but instead of carrying them to the east, this time it sweeps them to the south, where eventually they spot a landmass on the horizon that stretches as far as the eyes can see. It is then that they realize that they have not found another island, but an entirely new continent. Upon arrival on the coast of what is now the Senegambian region of West Africa, they quickly realize that the natives look very different and speak a totally different language than any other group that they've encountered in the past. The African architecture varies dramatically from what they've seen before at home, and they notice several large animals unknown in the Americas, such as elephants, hippopotamus, and rhinoceros. Some of these large creatures even live among humans, such as horses and cattle, a concept completely unknown in most parts of the Americas. After peaceful interactions with the indigenous West Africans, whom would have been citizens of the Mali Empire at this time, many of the Taino sailors began to fall sick to the smallpox disease and die within days, with others already showing symptoms of the same sickness. Fearing for the worst, the Taino decide to head back to the Cape Verde Islands to take refuge, but not before local medicine men teach them an indigenous technique known as inoculation, a practice of creating a small cut within the skin and applying some of the fluid from one of the smallpox into it. The human body is significantly more efficient at building up antibodies when the disease is contracted through the skin rather than through the air, and thus dramatically increasing chances of survival. Virtual immunity to the disease is granted once the wound is healed, and in our real timeline, this practice was so widespread in West Africa that it was even imported to the Americas when it was taught to Bostonian Reverend Cotton Mather by his slave in the year 1706. Eventually, the Taino sailors returned home laden with exotic goods from Africa such as ivory and iron swords, and they all bear scars on their arms from inoculation. Despite this, the tribal violence in the Antilles is still running rampant, so the Taino sailors decide to set up colonies in the Azores and Cape Verde, where they become middlemen in the exchange of goods between Africa and the Americas. While it is very likely that these sailors would have also discovered the Iberian Peninsula by way of the Azores as well, for this alternate scenario, we will X out that possibility for the sake of consistency. Among these merchants, inoculation would become a standard practice, as it would be impossible for them to continue their trade networks with West Africa if not immune to this deadly disease, in which they had never been exposed to before. In our real timeline, the devastation of old world diseases resulted in the death of between 90 and 95% of the Native American population in modern day United States. And as a result, less than 2% of the present population of the United States identifies as Native American. Despite the immunity to smallpox, however, malaria poses another new threat to the Taino. Malaria is not contagious, but is primarily transmitted through mosquito vectors, which effectively creates a barrier to the Taino traders, limiting them to the coastal regions and the islands of West Africa. more specifically, the more arid regions of West Africa that don't host breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Despite these barriers, the Taino merchants began exporting crops such as corn, which fueled a demographic boom in West Africa, leading to Mali growing larger and more powerful and significantly more populous than it had ever been before in our real timeline. In exchange, Mali sends African goods such as rice, horses, and cattle, as well as iron weaponry, technology that allows the Tainos to effectively protect their trading ports from neighboring peoples who only have stone weaponry. Over time, news of this trade spreads to Mesoamerica, and through this exchange of information, it is soon discovered that the cinchona bark from Central America and South America, traditionally used as a muscle relaxant, contains anti-malarial properties. In our real timeline, this exact same discovery is what allowed Europeans to more easily conquer African kingdoms in the 19th and 20th centuries, as malaria was one of the most imposing barriers of colonization in the hot and wet climates of West Africa. Another inevitable result of this extended Mesoamerican trade network would have been direct contact between the Mali and Mesoamerican peoples, the most dominant group at the time being the Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula. Over time, West African goods such as horses and iron weapons would become commonplace in the Yucatan Peninsula. Naturally, the Mali Empire would see great benefit in prioritizing funding into its own maritime ventures, which will lead to several ambassadors and migrants to the New World. We could also realistically expect some of these states to adopt Islam as a means of securing trust, loyalty, and reliability of trade with their West African partners. A Maya Sultanate could be a real possibility, perhaps from a marriage alliance between Mali and Mayapan, or simply from the Mayan ruler wanting to secure a bond of trust and economic loyalty. This is a pattern witnessed time and time again in our real timeline. When Islam arrived in Africa, we consistently see that states that adopted Islam were the most successful, as Arabic and Berber traders from the north allowed them full monopoly on trade routes, as opposed to their traditional pagan neighbors. The same principle applies with European nations preferring their Christian neighbors over their Islamic ones for trades. So the Mayapan and potentially Taino themselves would adopt Islam for the same reason, reaping the benefits of trade in horses, cattle, iron weapons, and other goods from Africa. In turn, Mali, as mentioned before, would grow even more powerful from American crops and medicine such as corn and quinine, and by taking cues from the sophisticated practices of Mayan mathematics, stone architecture, and infrastructure such as paved roadways and aqueducts. The significant impact that these innovations and resources have for the Mali Empire would also encourage them to invest more of their time and resources into perfecting their own maritime capabilities, picking up on the practices of more advanced ships of the Islamic world, such as the Arabic dhows or the East African mtepes. Over the next several decades, it is likely that we would even see entirely new populations both in Africa and in the Americas, composed largely of immigrants and peoples of mixed African and Native American heritage. So with all of this cultural, technological, and mercantile exchange in this alternate scenario, what will be the biggest differences between this timeline and the real timeline? Well, firstly, though wars and conquests would most certainly transpire during these encounters, the scale would not be nearly as high as our real timeline, considering the fact that the trade would more than likely be much more peaceful, as the cultural and political objectives of the traders more than likely wouldn't follow the same model as that of European conquistadors, who specifically set out to find new lands to conquer and gold to plunder. Secondly, though disease would still pose a huge threat to Native American populations, West African smallpox inoculation and Central American malarial remedies would severely limit the impact of these diseases in the New World. Peaceful trade relations would also encourage intermarriage, which would lead to mixed populations of peoples whom would likely carry the resilient immune systems of peoples of the Old World to fight off these Old World diseases. And thus plagues and epidemics of the real timeline would be extremely reduced and possibly non-existent. Lastly, with this slower pacing, Native American civilizations will be able to gradually and naturally adopt Old World innovations such as horses and ironsmithing, allowing for the continuation of their own civilizations and the birth of entirely new cultures blending traditional culture with Old World culture and innovations. This will set the stage and potentially a very rude awakening for the European antagonists in the 15th and 16th centuries. If you would like to see how these Native American civilizations would fare up against their European counterparts, please be sure to check out part 2 on Aztlan Historian's channel, which I will leave a link to below and actually right here in the video. The next alternate scenario video that I will do will cover a Mongol invasion of sub-Saharan Africa, submitted by one of my several supportive patrons. Don't forget to watch part 2 on Aztlan's channel, and always remember, We don't come from nothing.